I've already signed the papers to disinherit you, so pack your bags and leave this estate before I have security drag you out. Your peasant background was always a stain on this family name. My husband, Julian, stood by the mahogany fireplace, his voice booming with cold, calculated authority, while his mistress, Serena, let out a soft, mocking hum from the velvet armchair. I looked at the man I'd spent 10 years building a life with, the man who now looked at me like a piece of trash left on the sidewalk. If that's what you want, Julian, keep the money, the trust fund, and the estate. I don't need a single cent of it. I turned my back on them, not because I was hurt, but because I knew something they didn't, a secret I had kept locked away to see if his love was ever truly for me, or just the image I helped him maintain. Every step I took toward the door felt like shedding a layer of armor I hadn't realized I was wearing. The house, which used to feel like a fortress, now felt like a cage built of glass and lies. I spent the last decade playing the dutiful wife, balancing his checkbooks, smoothing over his public relations disasters, and acting as the silent architect behind his most successful mergers. I walked out of that house with nothing but the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Julian thought he was stripping me of everything, but he was actually the one walking into a blind alley. For 5 months, I disappeared. I didn't reach out, I didn't look back, and I certainly didn't beg for the alimony he was so eager to deny me. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of the city, a place where no one knew my name or my bank account balance. I needed to see how long it would take him to realize that the peasant he married was the only reason his company wasn't already underwater. The first month was quiet, almost painfully so. I spent my mornings drinking bitter coffee and watching the city wake up from my balcony. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent curating Julian's life, making sure he had the right connections, the right clothes, and acting as the silent architect behind his most successful mergers. My phone buzzed against the wooden kitchen table, a sharp, insistent vibration that cut through the quiet room. It was a notification from the business district's security portal. Julian had been trying to track my location through a shared cloud account, but I had scrubbed myself from his reach weeks ago. He was panicking. His company's latest merger was failing, and he had no idea that the poor girl he kicked out held the controlling shares of the firm's main supplier. He was desperate for my return, not because he loved me, but because he was drowning, and he didn't even know how to swim. I spent my days working in the quiet, sterile halls of a firm that specialized in high-end corporate restructuring. The silence of the office was my new sanctuary. It was ironic, really. He had spent months trying to find me, assuming I was working at a diner, while I was actually the one reviewing the legal documents that would decide if his company survived the week. The tension in my chest eased, a slow, deep exhale, as I realized the trap was fully set. He had spent every penny he had on his new life with Serena, buying her expensive cars and hosting parties that were bleeding his accounts dry. I remembered a time 3 years ago when we were at an auction. Julian wanted to buy a piece of art that was way beyond our budget at the time. He was ready to leverage the company's stability just to impress a client. I stepped in, redirected the funds, and made sure he lost the bid while making it look like an administrative error by the gallery. He threw a tantrum for days. I just kept smiling, knowing I had saved the company from a massive lawsuit. He never thanked me. He just got angry. That was the moment I stopped loving him and started protecting myself. Here is the real question for those of you who have poured your own lives into someone else's success. At what point does loyalty stop being a virtue and start being a trap that costs you your entire identity? Drop a comment below, like this audio story, and hit that subscribe button to join our community. Have you ever sacrificed your own dreams for a partner only to realize you were just a placeholder for their ego? Suddenly, my office door creaked open, a slow, ominous sound. I looked up to see my supervisor standing there, his voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper.
There's a high-profile client in the lobby, and he's insisting on seeing the lead consultant. He says he knows you. Julian Thorne. I smoothed my blazer and walked toward the lobby. My mind was racing, not with fear, but with the cold, calculated precision of a chess master. I had spent months anticipating this moment. I rounded the corner, my heels clicking sharply against the polished granite. Julian stood by the reception desk, his breathing heavy and uneven, while Serena hung off his arm. When he saw me, he froze. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He blinked, looking at my professional suit and the high-level security badge clipped to my lapel. He clearly expected to find me in a waitress uniform, not running the most feared restructuring firm in the state. You? Julian finally managed, his voice strained and tight. What are you doing here, Cassidy? Are you cleaning this place? Serena let out a shrill, nervous laugh, but it died instantly when she heard the respectful way my colleagues greeted me as I passed. I didn't acknowledge her. I looked directly at Julian, my voice calm, flat, and devoid of warmth. I'm not here to clean, Julian. I'm the lead consultant on the Thorne Enterprises liquidation project. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Julian gripped his briefcase, the leather creaking under his white-knuckled pressure. "That's impossible," he muttered. "The consultant for that project is a mysterious entity known as the architect. There is no way it's you." I stepped closer, my voice steady, like a blade. "Surprise! I've been building my own wealth since the day you met me, Julian. You just never cared enough to look past my bank account. You thought I was a burden, a charity case you took in. In reality, I was the only thing standing between you and complete financial ruin for the last 10 years. Serena stepped forward, her voice rising in a panicked pitch. "Julian, tell her to stop this." I looked at her then, my gaze lingering on the hollow sound of her jewelry hitting the desk. "You might want to check the authenticity of those diamonds, Serena. My ex-husband has been so busy funding your lifestyle that he missed the fact that his company's assets were being moved into my holding accounts months ago. Every gift he bought you was basically on loan from my portfolio." Julian's face went white. He stepped forward, trying to contain his composure, but his hands were trembling. "We can settle this. I'll give you whatever you want. Just tell them you're mistaken about the liquidation." He was begging, but his voice was still laced with that familiar, entitled arrogance. He still thought he could buy his way out of this with words, as if money was the only thing that mattered. Julian's breath caught, a ragged, desperate sound, and he looked like he might collapse right there. He tried to reach for my arm, but I stepped back, the movement sharp and decisive. At that exact moment, the firm's CEO walked out, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Everything ready for the board meeting, Cassidy?" he asked. Julian stood there watching the man who controlled his entire financial life treat me like his equal. The power shift was absolute. If you're enjoying this intense moment, please like, comment, and subscribe to see how this showdown concludes. We walked into the boardroom, the silence so thick you could feel it. Julian sat at the end of the table, his tie loosened, his hands shaking. The sound of his gold ring tapping rhythmically against the glass table was the only thing filling the void. Serena was barred from entering by security, and I could hear her muffled, frantic protests fading down the hall. This was the pinnacle of his nightmare. As the board members took their seats, I opened my laptop, the soft whir of the cooling fan audible in the quiet room, and projected the real financial state of Thorne Enterprises. It wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. "As you can see," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a razor, "the company has been insolvent for months. My firm has been quietly acquiring the debt." A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Julian stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a setup. She's been manipulating everything from the shadows." He was desperate now, his voice raw. I didn't flinch. I just clicked the next slide. It showed the proof of his secret offshore accounts, the ones he thought were hidden from the IRS. You didn't disinherit me, Julian, I said, leaning forward, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. I disinherited yourself the moment you thought your arrogance was a substitute for actual business intelligence. You handed me the keys to your destruction the day you signed those power of attorney documents without reading them. I watched him sink back into his chair, the soft wheeze of his breath the only sound left. He looked older, smaller. He reached out as if to beg for an extension, but the board members were already whispering, their voices cold and final. They knew I held the cards, and more importantly, they knew I was the one who had kept this company afloat when Julian was busy playing golf in the Bahamas. The lead board member, a man who had ignored me for a decade, finally looked at me with a mixture of respect and fear. Cassidy, he began, his voice hesitant, are you suggesting the company is effectively yours? I looked him straight in the eye. I am suggesting that I have managed every single asset of this firm for the last 10 years, and for the last 6 months, I have been the primary creditor. The company is, by all legal standards, my responsibility now. The silence that followed was heavy with realization. Julian tried to interrupt, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple, but a wave of my hand silenced him. Do not interrupt the proceedings, Julian. Your time for speaking ended the moment you decided your ego was more important than the payroll. I watched him shrink into the upholstery of his chair. It was a fascinating study in human psychology, the way a man who believed he was a titan could be reduced to nothing simply by being reminded of his own incompetence. I felt a surge of cold, clean power, not the kind that destroys, but the kind that corrects. I was resetting the scale, and for once, the weight was resting firmly in my own hands. I didn't need to yell, I didn't need to cry. I just needed to present the truth. And the truth was an avalanche he could never hope to outrun. Suddenly, the fire alarm in the building began to blare, a jarring, piercing sound that shattered the tension. People stood up, grabbing their belongings in a rush of noise. In the confusion, Julian lunged across the table, grabbing my wrist. Cassidy, please, we can fix this. Forget the money. Just tell them it's a mistake. His grip was desperate, his breathing labored and shallow. I looked at his hand on my wrist, then up at his tear-filled eyes. It's not a mistake, Julian. It's a consequence. I pulled my arm away as security rushed in to restrain him. They didn't have to be rough, but the shame of it was clear in his heavy, broken exhales. He was being removed from his own company, his own board, and his own life. The look he gave me wasn't one of anger anymore. It was one of pure, broken defeat. The board members barely looked at him as they signed the liquidation papers. They weren't just ending a company, they were dismantling the ego that had propped it up for too long. Smash that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories of justice. How far do you think he'll go to try and get his power back? And do you think he learned his lesson, or is he already looking for someone else to blame? The building was quiet again. The sirens fading into the distance, leaving only the soft, ambient hum of the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass. Julian was gone. He had been escorted out of the building by security, his keycard confiscated, and his access codes revoked in real time. I stood in the center of the lobby, watching the golden hour light stretch across the marble floors. For the first time in 10 years, I felt entirely, completely alone, but in the best way possible. I wasn't anyone's wife, I wasn't a silent partner, and I certainly wasn't an accessory to Julian's ambition. I was just Cassidy. A week later, I received a heavy, cream-colored envelope at my new office. It was a letter from Serena. She had left Julian the moment the money stopped coming in, her loyalty proving to be as thin as the designer labels she obsessed over. The letter was filled with bitter, screeching accusations, blaming him for everything from the loss of her social status to the sudden downgrade of her lifestyle. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. The life they had tried to build on top of my hard work was gone, and I was moving on. I realized that my value was never the balance in a shared bank account or the size of a suburban estate. My value was the work I did, the integrity I held, and the future I was building on my own terms. I found myself reflecting on the years I spent being the support system for a man who viewed me as a liability. I remembered the nights I stayed up until 3 a.m. perfecting the financial projections for his projects, only for him to take the credit at the morning board meeting. I remembered the way I had to apologize for his temper to our mutual friends, constantly smoothing over the jagged edges of his personality. It was exhausting. It was a slow, quiet erosion of my own spirit. But as I sat at my new desk, a modest, clean space that I owned, not borrowed, I felt a sudden, profound sense of clarity. Every struggle, every sleepless night, and every compromise I made had been a lesson in what I would never tolerate again. I walked to my car, the metallic click of the door unlocking ringing in the empty concrete garage. I saw Julian standing on the corner across the street, waiting for a city bus. He looked defeated, his suit rumpled, his hair unkempt, his breathing heavy and erratic. He looked over, our eyes locked for a split second. I didn't stop. I didn't wave. I simply pulled away, the engine purring as I drove toward my new life. There was no need for final words. The silence between us was loud enough to drown out any apology he could ever offer. He looked like a man trying to read a language he had forgotten, and I realized he would spend the rest of his life wondering how the peasant had outsmarted the king. The city lights stretched out before me like a map of endless possibilities. For the first time, I wasn't living for the weekend or for the next social function or for Julian's approval. I was living for the challenge, for the growth, and for the simple, beautiful fact that I was the author of my own story. The past 10 years were a long, complicated chapter, but the book wasn't closed. It was just getting started. I stopped at a quiet park near the edge of the city to watch the stars emerge. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and coming rain, a scent that reminded me of freedom. I took out my planner, the one that used to be filled with Julian's meetings and his social obligations, and I began to write. I wrote down my goals, my aspirations, and the boundaries I would never let anyone cross again. I wasn't writing a list of things to do. I was writing a manifesto for a life lived with purpose. I thought about the irony of it all, how Julian had spent his entire life trying to be the most important person in the room, only to end up standing on a street corner irrelevant. And here I was, someone he hadn't even bothered to truly know, finally becoming the person I was always meant to be. The silence of the park was perfect. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of my old marriage, but a light, expansive silence that allowed me to hear my own thoughts. I realized then that the best revenge wasn't in winning or losing, but in outgrowing the people who tried to keep you small. Julian was a footnote in a book I had already finished. I had my career, my independence, and a future that didn't depend on anyone's approval but my own. The road ahead was open, and for the first time, I wasn't looking back at what I had left behind. I was finally, truly moving forward. If you believe in standing up for yourself when someone underestimates your worth, please make sure to like this audio story, drop a comment with your favorite moment, and subscribe for more content just like this. Thank you for being part of this journey. We are building a community here, one story at a time. What was the defining moment for you when you realized you had to change your life no matter the cost? Share it in the comments. I'm reading every one of them. Your stories are the reason I keep telling mine.